I have the delight of introducing Lucy, who will then take on introducing David and Rob. So Lucy has been with Stanford PAC since 2012, and she leads our digital civil society lab, looking at safe, ethical, effective use of data, the issues related to privacy and security, accountability and transparency. She is an expert in this field that we are talking about. She's a senior scholar at Stanford. She earned her PhD at Stanford. She has also been a fellow at the Packard Foundation, at Rockefeller's Bellagio Center, at New America Foundation. She, for 10 years, has written the industry standard on philanthropy, Blueprint for Social Impact, and she's a co-author with Rob Reich on philanthropy and democratic societies. It gives me great pleasure to hand off to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kim. Thank you to everyone who makes this day possible. I want to actually begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Muwekma Ohlone people, the traditional stewards of the land on which we're gathered. As Kim mentioned, I'm Lucy Bernholtz, and with Rob Reich, I'm the co-director of the Digital Civil Society Lab, which is just one of the many research initiatives at Stanford PACS. In 2012, Rob and I began the work that led to the lab. And basically what we were trying to do then, and I think what we're trying to still do now, is to understand, inform, and improve the ways in which we as individual people can come together to voluntarily associate, to take collective action, whether that's physically or philanthropically, to make the world a better place in an age of digital dependencies. In other words, we started this work. I'm an historian by training, so let me contextualize that for you. We started the work pre-Snowden. We launched the lab post-Snowden, and since 2016, we have been delightfully joined by numerous efforts across this university and across the world to really understand what it means for philanthropy, civil society, democracy to function and to thrive in a digital age. Just some of the other Stanford initiatives which we are eagerly and gratefully partnering with now: the program on democracy and the internet, the Cyber Policy Center, is specifically the Global Digital Policy Incubator, where there are numerous teaching efforts underway. Rob is a leader on some of them. We'll talk about that. But there are also efforts focused on what you might know as public interest technology. We're partnering with the Center for Comparative Studies on Race and Ethnicity on a Race and Technology Fellowship program. We work with the McCoy Center on Ethics and with the university-wide newly launched Human-Centered AI Initiative. In other words, here at Stanford, we are all in on understanding and informing the good, the bad, the ugly, and the potential of our digitally mediated world and its implications for each of us as people, as citizens, as in our ability to take collective action, to act philanthropically, and for our democracy to thrive. So, I read the news today. Oh boy. And I have to say, it leaves me with more questions than answers. First of all, we have to acknowledge that for a conversation about ethics, technology, and policy, we also have to recognize that ethics and philanthropy are in the news today like rarely in our lifetimes. And that's something we must each address. But we also pick up the news and read about and must ask ourselves, just what role does media manipulation play in both the Brexit vote of 3 years ago and what's going on with the United Kingdom today? Or what laws should apply when a major company partners with local police departments to sell surveillance cameras masquerading as doorbells? And how should we as philanthropists think about the use of digital tools that yes, they can make humanitarian aid and refugee services more efficient, but they do so by creating a kind of surveillance humanitarianism at the southern border of this country and in other borders around the world, subjecting individuals to a type of digital data collection that the very philanthropists who are funding some of this work would never allow for themselves. To help us think through both the ethical and legal issues, I'm pleased and delighted to be joined by Rob Reich and David Seigel. There are full biographies in your program. Let me just give you a little bit on each of them. Rob Reich, to the far left, is a professor here of political science and, by courtesy, philosophy and education. He is the director of the McCoy Center on Ethics and Society, as well as a co-director of Stanford PACS, as Kim and Laura mentioned. And he is teaching faculty in Stanford's Human-Centered AI program. He co-teaches a class in the computer science department called Ethics, Tech, and Public Policy. And he is a prolific writer on questions of justice and democracy. His most recent book, Just Giving, looks specifically at the role of philanthropic foundations in democracies. David Seigel is the co-founder of Two Sigma, a financial services company that is transforming the way that industry works and the way products are sold and investments are managed. David is also a prolific philanthropist. We are grateful for his support of Stanford PACS, and particularly the Digital Civil Society Lab, but he also sits on more boards than I could actually memorize, including that of Cornell Tech and the Khan Academy. So please join me in welcoming Rob and Dave. I covered a swath of territory there. So I'm going to ask you two to make it a little more specific for us. First thing to get us started, when we think about ethics and technology, help us figure out what are the burning issues. Help us build a collective list of burning issues that folks should be thinking about, maybe from the headlines. And I'll let Rob go.
Yeah, please.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess I want to say what I'm sure is obvious to all of you, that at some level, having been in Silicon Valley for 20 plus years, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say of this current moment that the bloom is off the rose of Silicon Valley, and the early days of techno-enthusiasm and utopianism have given way to a kind of doomsaying, Facebook is destroying democracy. And we've sort of whipsawed between these two orientations. I think it's high time that we sober up, so to speak, and take a mature look at the various issues that technology poses to our civic institutions and our democratic institutions. And maybe one other way that I'd encourage all of us to think about it, this is certainly the way I think about it, my own view is that the most important field of study in the 20th century was economics, and then the most important profession in the world were financiers. They helped to power globalization. They totally rewrote the rules about how it is that societies chart their own growth. In the 21st century, I think economists and financiers have been displaced, and the most important field of study today is computer science, and the most important profession is software engineering. David happens to sit at the intersection of those two places. And we need to pay as much attention to economics and financiers as in the 20th century as we do today to technologists, basically. So what are some of the burning issues? I'd say that this course I teach has 4 different modules. I could give you, chock-a-block examples in each of them, but I'll just tick them off so you get a sense of the buckets or the categories I think about. There's algorithmic decision making and the outsourcing of human decisions to machines and how to understand what to do when that takes place within civic institutions or political institutions. Second, there's questions about data privacy and civil liberties. There's a new book out called Surveillance Capitalism that suggests that the heart of many Silicon Valley companies is a compact in which we extract data from individuals and use that then to power the business model of the company. Third issue, ethics and artificial intelligence. That's really a huge and growing important issue as the power of artificial intelligence has magnified over just the past couple of years and almost certainly will continue to do so. Autonomous vehicles or lethal autonomous weapons are just a couple of the examples that fall into that category. And finally, I would want to think about the power of the large tech platforms, or the power of big tech. And the questions that arise there are things like antitrust. Elizabeth Warren wants to try to break up some of the big tech companies, or some of the questions that you suggested at the start, Lucy, about misinformation or disinformation. These platforms which mediate our speech and our association online, they algorithmically uprank and downrank things that we have to say. Sometimes they prevent human beings from putting things online into a public forum. The private companies that run these platforms have the power to decide what counts as permissible speech. They have the power to amplify or not to amplify this speech. And the rules that surround the decision-making are oftentimes not transparent at all. And so that poses a big challenge. I'd say I summarize all of this by saying technology companies are no longer the small David fighting the Goliath trying to disrupt the world. They have become the Goliath. They are amongst the most powerful actors on the world stage today. And these companies have what you could just simply describe as civic and political dimensions to their work, even if they conceive of themselves as simply business operations seeking to make a profit. And because they have these civic and political dimensions, we as citizens have to pay attention to the kinds of decisions that are going on, the kinds of decisions that engineers and technologists are making.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. The way I frame it in my mind is that the tech industry has essentially become critical infrastructure. 20 years ago, the tech industry was developing interesting things that were on the periphery of our everyday lives, and the wide range of experimentation was extremely healthy because the impact that experimentation had on the fabric of society was relatively minimal. I would draw parallels to, and by the way, I think this is natural and healthy. I would draw parallels to medicine, before the FDA, or the finance, in the 1800s. These emerging industries back then, initially they were not so critical, and no one really cared what they were doing. And there was a great amount of experimentation. Much of it turned out to be unhealthy, certainly in the case of medicine. And society had to rapidly evolve to acknowledge the fact that finance and medicine had become so critical.
Can I pick up one thing from that? An analogy to medicine, I think, is important because we're here at a university, and I've, for a good part of my career here, had nothing to do with either the School of Medicine or the School of Engineering. And as Lucy mentioned, for the past year, I've been now collaborating with people inside the School of Engineering and teaching a class in the Computer Science Department of Ethics and Technology. And what I've come to learn is that as someone who's an ethicist, I noticed that in the School of Medicine, you can't become a doctor without exposure to bioethics. Every single hospital in the country will have an ethics committee that's a part of the decision-making. There's something that all universities are bound by when doing research with human subjects called the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. There's no parallel to the School of Engineering in that respect. You can get through a computer science education without systematic exposure to something called engineering ethics, which doesn't exist in the same way that bioethics does. Tech companies nowadays are suddenly trying to form ethics teams or ethics task forces, maybe analogously to the way that hospitals have them. And unlike anyone who's doing biomedical research, whether it's in a pharmaceutical company or at a university, you have to pass through the IRB. You can't just experiment any way you want on human subjects. People who are data scientists have no equivalent. They can do research of any kind that they want. There's no such thing as being barred from the profession if you engage in malpractice. You can screw up as an engineer over and over again, and if you're a 10x engineer or a 100x engineer, you're almost certainly to get another job. There's no Hippocratic Oath equivalent. So this whole institutional infrastructure that grew up in medicine has just the beginning seeds within schools of engineering. And I think that's something we all need to encourage and help develop in the coming years.
And there are parallels as well to finance, where I've spent quite of my life involved with from a business perspective. Imagine that there were no rules concerning insider trading or market manipulation. That would really lead to extreme chaos, and in fact, fundamentally, everyone would be going to the lowest common denominator to remain competitive with each other, meaning that everything would be completely destabilized. And yet in areas such as data privacy, there really are no first principles. It's very difficult to imagine creating a level playing field if every firm gets to interpret this in their own way. I do not believe, by the way, and many people have been suggesting one solution is to, firms should have chief ethics officers to help guide the thinking of the organization. I kind of chuckle at that because, imagine in finance that you got rid of all of the regulation and you replaced it with, ethics officers to just decide what would be okay. I don't see how it would be. I don't see how it would be any different.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you what might make a difference then. Rob, you've mentioned a few things that might be done in the academy then to think about ethics before we move from ethics to law. But David, what might work before we get to the regulatory possibilities about training or a different kind of perspective for the kinds of engineers and algorithmic decision-making thinkers that you employ in your industry? What do we need that's before we get to the legal questions?
For sure. I think, I've thought about that quite a bit. And I think some of it has to do with the culture and mission statement that your organization creates. If you, long ago at my firm, we were, trying to think through a mission statement. This is, a couple 15 years ago. And, someone had suggested, it's an investment management firm, that, the appropriate mission would be to, make a lot of money because it's an investment management firm. And then I pointed out to them that, well, sure, the investors want good return, but, that really is kind of a very generic mission statement. And any company could simply say that their mission is to make a lot of money for their investors. And so I pushed hard to have something much more nuanced. I think that if your mission is overly simplified, just essentially make a lot of money, it creates a perverse culture. And so by having a balanced mission, you encourage people to think about what you're doing the right way. In addition, you might discourage people from wanting to work with you who are only interested in the unidimension, make a lot of money.
Yeah. So it comes down, at least a big part of it is the people and how they're trained.
And the culture that you build. I would say, most importantly, really, the culture that you build. I don't think that, I'm an optimistic individual. I think that most people, will do, have, good ethics. I think that, the wrong cultures, push them away from that.
So the two of you got together last year and wrote an article in Wired magazine that called for tech companies to develop a body somewhat similar to FINRA in the financial services industry, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea that you put forward?
Yeah, please.
Sure, I'll start off. The idea here is that when it comes to big tech companies and the way that they're, as private companies, they have permission to decide what's permissible to put on their platforms or not. I think it's fair to say that in the world today, what Facebook decides is allowable online is way more powerful than what France says, or what Google decides is way more powerful than what Germany says. That's a line from a colleague of ours, Timothy Garton-Ash. The private companies have acquired this great power to regulate our speech. In the US, we have this tradition of the First Amendment in which the government is blocked from being a speech authority and blocking speech. So in this particular case, when it comes to what's permissible to put online, it seems to us that it would be really desirable if there was a self-regulatory body, not a formal set of laws passed by government, in which there was some collective agreement about what would be called content moderation or content regulation. And so that it wasn't some platforms do X, Y, or Z and ban some speech or uprank other speech, and other platforms do something else. If there's a collective agreement, think of it in the following way. The Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, is the body in the United States that provides the ratings for films, G, PG, R, X, or no rating. That's not imposed by law. That was an agreement of the large industry players to provide this public-facing way of regulating the films that are released so that people had information about what they should allow their kids to see or what they might go see. It doesn't have the imprimatur of the legislature imposing that. It's a collective decision of the major players in the industry to regulate themselves. And I think that's what's necessary. We think that's what's necessary on the question of content moderation with respect to tech companies.
And to add to that, I think that the legislative process is very slow-moving. It is not designed for dynamic problems that often you need quick responses to. And so if the industry does not find a way to address these problems on their own, eventually there will be all kinds of legislation which will probably not work all that well, would probably be a worse outcome for the industry and everyone. And so we believe that the industry should try much harder to find mechanisms to solve the problem collectively. To achieve this, though, you would probably need some amount of government blessing, because you don't want to create a situation where you have a cartel, for example, a couple of large companies working together to set rules that favor, for example, only themselves. So the way that this would, I think, come to play would be that the government would set some ground rules for how the collaboration would work, and then the collaboration would have to not be just amongst a couple of the biggest tech companies, but it would have to be representative of both the large companies, emerging competitors, and firms that are on the periphery of the activity.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually a question, because where are the bounds of the tech industry now? I mean, how do you decide who would be participating in that and who isn't? Because one of the reasons we're talking about this at a philanthropy conference, and the reason the Digital Civil Society Lab exists, is because we're all dependent on these technologies. We don't all create them, but we all use them.
Right.
So how do you decide who's in and who's out for something like this?
Yeah, right. I think you're right to say that the tech industry as a discrete set of companies to think about may not be the appropriate way forward. I'm not sure who said this first. It's probably an old line, but the analogy is that electricity is something we're all dependent on, every single company, every single person, and there's an electrical industry, but we have to think about ways of constructing it so that it's a piece of our common infrastructure. Maybe certain parts of the tech industry are moving in that direction as well. And so we won't talk about the tech industry in Silicon Valley as such, we talk about the digital infrastructure of our lives. I think we're groping our way toward if not a solution, at least a framework for thinking about that. And we're in the earliest possible stages of it.
Yeah, that's a key question. Sometimes I think that one grouping that it might be interesting to think about is I call them information brokers. So you could think of firms like Facebook and Google and many others as really an information exchange. It's exchanging. Really, that's what they're doing. They're trading information amongst people, and then they're finding a way to monetize that information exchange. And so you could perhaps try to develop some general broad categories that represented the different kinds of activities that the tech industry that form this critical infrastructure of society.
Interesting. I mean, it also then raises the question, because while you're proposing a self-regulatory body and putting out some thoughts on the challenges of regulation and legislation, which certainly exist, the next question then becomes, so do nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, which exchange data all the time for solving environmental problems or trying to cure certain diseases, do they operate under the same set of rules? Do they operate under a separate set of rules? When the currency of exchange is digitized data and the place of exchange are these digital networks. How do we think about distinguishing the activities that do, the enterprises that use very similar activities, but the purported benefit is public as opposed to make as much money as possible?
Yeah. I think that's a super important question, and to try to understand the ways in which the digital infrastructure within civil society organizations, association life, either should be different or needs to be specific to civil society organizations. Of course, this is in part the work of the Civil Society Lab. But just take what you described before. I mean, just, this idea of when we sign up for some app or, have an account on one of these big platforms, we tick off a box in the terms of service in which we agree to share our data with the company for, personalizing its services to us, ads, and the basic business model. In civil society organizations, you might think that it's not a term of service that you sign that then allows the nonprofit to take your data to do its work, but perhaps we're donating our data. And the right way to think about the relationship between the user and the nonprofit is a matter of donation. And using some of the familiar transactional terms, language of donation within civil society, could possibly influence the way we think about what happens in for-profit organizations themselves. There used to be a time, probably still today, when you went to the hospital and you had a blood test done, and you might get a form that says, would you be willing to share the results of your blood test or aspects of your blood with some biobank for the benefit of research in medicine? Maybe what would be useful within for-profit industry is that there are large common data pools, suitably de-identified presumably, that were then made for the benefit of lots of people to do research about issues of misinformation, all the usual things. So I'm actually interested these days in seeing what types of protocols from civil society might be exported into the for-profit industry, and to see whether they can do any work there.
Yeah, slightly related to that, I think one of the biggest transformations that has occurred, globally over the last 20 years is the essentially vast digitization of everything that occurs in our lives. And it's now very nicely recorded in server farms, much of it in a very obtuse way. Right. And then the ability to utilize this data to make money. And it's really, I'm surprised that this point is not more widely recognized. I'm not being judgmental. It's very good. I mean, it's similar to, you might find some, raw material. Oil wouldn't be very valuable without the internal combustion engine. And so it turns out that the combination of data and AI and other analysis techniques, cheap computer power, cheap disk storage, is completely transformational. And so many companies latched onto this, or not many, some companies latched onto this pretty quickly, and you know who they are, and they've done very well. It'll be very interesting to see how the next decade or two plays out. And philanthropy has, I think, a critical role to play here. Right. It is not a fait accompli that necessarily the people that are controlling all the data today should or will control it exactly the same way forever. But we, as society, have to reflect upon this. I'm not sure that the government is through legislation, is the right way to reflect on this. I think the reflection is going to have to occur in a more philanthropic way, in a more academic way. I think it's very important also that this reflection not be just a bunch of intellectuals thinking about it. It really has to reflect the broad wishes of greater society, and that may be a little bit harder to capture. But one important way to capture this is to make sure that broader society is more informed about what is occurring, so they can participate intelligently in the debate.
Yeah, can I add something to that? Because I think that allows a nice bridge to the subtitle of the session on public interest technology. So I mean, in certain respects, what that phrase is meant to indicate has something to do with, you're going to meet Darren Walker in a bit. The Ford Foundation is behind one of the efforts to promote what they call public interest technology. And the basic idea is along the lines of what David was just suggesting. We need to develop in society a generation of people with the technological skills that you can get from a place like Stanford if you major in computer science, but where your only destination is not a Silicon Valley tech company, but you're as likely to go work for a civil society organization, which of course needs people with these skills just as much as any other organization does, as well as working within public agencies. So the analogy here is something like there was a foundation-funded, a philanthropically funded effort back in, I think, the 1950s to create what's known as public interest law. So if you had gone to law school in the 1940s and you got a JD, you basically had two professional destinations. You could go work for a corporate law firm, or you could work in a public defender's office, some type of Department of Justice type outfit. And there was an effort to create clinics within law schools, so you could have a clinical experience, and then professional pathways into civil society organizations, so that if you got a JD, you could work for a nonprofit promoting some type of social advocacy or public advocacy. Right now, there's this enormous juggernaut at Stanford of the CS education in which students are majoring in CS in absolutely record numbers. And they're almost inevitable destination after they graduate is to be recruited aggressively and appropriately by a bunch of tech companies, which is a fine thing. But what would our world be like if instead of having that as the only and inevitable destination of someone with a CS degree, they were as likely to go work for a nonprofit or for a public agency to deploy these incredibly valuable technology skills that would allow for a social, society-wide conversation about the impact of technology. The usual joke line to say here is that our world would likely be somewhat better if, when Mark Zuckerberg appears before some Senate committee hearing, the questions aren't as technologically daft as they were. When one senator asks him, so just remind me again, if you give your service away, how is it you make money? And Mark Zuckerberg had to say in public, then, Senator, we sell advertising. And that's the level of general understanding of the tech industry from our most important public officials. And we need a generation of technologists who are as likely to inform public agencies and civil society organizations as they do to go work in tech companies.
I think, to amplify your point, unfortunately, most of society today is completely unfamiliar, not just the people in Washington, is completely unfamiliar as to how, I would say, the machinery of society is actually working. I 10 years ago, got involved with a project at MIT called Scratch, which works to teach kids how to code. I think that we need to really work hard to heavily increase the tech education, not just in college, but at a much earlier age, even for people who may not be going to college or traditional colleges. And in my experience with Scratch is that it turns out that young kids can easily be made far more tech literate. It's not beyond the reach. If we can very broadly increase the overall literacy of society, I'll say it differently. If we don't very broadly increase the overall tech literacy of society, I think we're in for big trouble because it will essentially cause very poor decisions to be made.
Yeah.
In the end, the Washington crowd is responding at some level to public opinion, and if the public is being denied the ability to think somewhat clearly about what's occurring, how in the world will the government make good decisions?
Can I add one thing to that? Lucy mentioned at the start that I've been teaching this new class. I've said something about it too, but I just want to describe, I think, an important path forward on exactly the type of education David was just describing. To gain the extraordinary skills of a computer scientist is super important for the reasons of technological literacy. But it's also important to make sure that the very same people who get those skills have a liberal education at a place like Stanford University, which is distinctively on offer. They get a humanistic and a social scientific framework for thinking about the enormous power of a technologist. And so there's been a class on offer at Stanford for roughly 30 years called something like Computers, Ethics, and Public Policy. And it had lots of positive aspects, but I'll give you a slight cartoon version of how students often understood it. If it was taught by the computer science professor, it was a whole bunch of discussions about coding and then a Wired magazine article about the trolley problem and autonomous vehicles and thinking about dilemmas of driving. Or it was taught by a philosopher on the ethics of technology, and it was 3 weeks of John Stuart Mill and 3 weeks of Immanuel Kant, and then the Wired magazine article on trolley problems and autonomous vehicles. And students saw through the hollowness of both approaches. So I've spent an entire year with Mehran Sahami, who's the most popular teacher at Stanford. He teaches the Introduction to Computer Science class, 900, 800 people a year. And Jeremy Weinstein, a fantastic social scientist, someone with experience in the highest levels of public policy. A year developing a course where the students get coding exercises, they have to write policy memos, and they have to write philosophy papers. And we developed, we think, a unique curriculum that tries to integrate these different perspectives so that we're not repeating the kind of hollower approach that I think was common in the past. And one last thing here, because I'm the ethicist in the group, I feel almost obliged to say this. The title of this session is Ethics in Tech. I'm worried sometimes that what people imagine the function of the ethics person is, it's as if like, you know, the kind of compliance police show up at the end of the conversation and the ethicist is the finger wagger. Oh, don't do that, or don't you see the worry over here? And while it's true that there are some ethics questions that involve saying basically no to people, I think of, you know, the local example is Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. So it doesn't take a genius to see that it's not ethically wise to sort of deceive your investors or deceive the public and then to move forward. You don't need a professional ethicist to call out something problematic there. And you can then talk about professional ethics in a way which gets more interesting, a Hippocratic Oath, what would that look like for engineers? But the most interesting ethical questions that all of us have a stake in answering, not just the ethics person as the expert, but all of us together, are where we have to choose amongst good things and where there's no clear or straightforward answer about how to make that choice. Here's an example, a concrete example we talk about in the class. Did you know maybe one of your kids has gone to a Taylor Swift concert in the past couple of years? So Taylor Swift has, like a lot of big celebrities do, a bunch of stalkers who constantly threaten her online. So in her large concerts, she's installed these video booths with facial recognition mapped onto a database of all of the people who are stalkers. So that, if you enter a Taylor Swift concert, your face print is being collected, and it's being mapped onto a database of known stalkers. Now, there's no consent you're making, there's no kind of a contractual exchange, it's just the terms for showing up at the concert that maybe are on some fine print in the ticket. Or think about, you know, Clear, if some of you use that technology at the airport with your biometric data in order to get through the line more quickly. These are examples of a contest between great goods. It's certainly a good thing to have security in concerts or in airports. And it also comes at the expense these days of giving over our biometric information or having our face prints taken by a for-profit company where we basically don't know what they're doing with it. Is Clear selling our biometric data to other companies or other countries? Are they sharing it with governments across the world? What's Taylor Swift doing with all the face prints she collects? This isn't like stop doing the obviously bad thing. Security is a super important value, but so is privacy. So the ethically interesting questions are how to make choices when there's a trade-off between these two great goods. And that's a decision not for a software engineer in a company to make by himself or herself alone, but for all of us to deliberate together. And that's where I think the interesting ethical questions rest.
Yeah, and I think some of the ethical questions are less obvious as well. As people now have recently observed, face recognition technology tends to perform better on certain ethnic groups than others, at least as developed by companies in the US. Now, and that's problematic if it's being used for screening or profiling. Software has been developed to help judges make sentencing decisions or to make parole boards make decisions about recidivism. And now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether or not these are good or bad things to be doing, but the people that have put these systems together, in many cases, did not really reflect very much on how to make their technology as fair and unbiased as possible. That was apparently an afterthought. And so so it may be, many of these technologies have multiple uses. Some of the uses are probably okay, and some of them are probably not okay, and there's a lot in between. But one thing is for sure, that the people that are developing the technology know best what the technology can and can't do. And I think the ethically correct thing to do here is to be more transparent about it. I am concerned, I'm not sure if you agree, but I would be concerned about an environment where a researcher at Stanford or MIT is working on face recognition technology, and people start protesting outside of their lab that that is inherently a bad thing to do. Because it's just, in my opinion, it's research, and research has to move forward. Similar to CRISPR, the gene splicing technology. I mean, clearly CRISPR could be used for some horrible things, but it also could be used for some potentially very good things. There is a good ethical debate about how you control the use of this technology and so on. But it's probably not a good idea to essentially have lots of people trying to decide what kind of research shouldn't be conducted. That, I think, would push us a little bit toward the dark ages. But to me, clearly, though, there is a gap where people aren't thinking long and hard about really what they've developed. What are the I'll give you a good example: self-driving car technology. So if you have you're following the industry, you might have a Tesla which approximates some of the capabilities. It is very unclear what these technologies can and cannot do. The industry is not particularly transparent about it. The people that are developing the technology tend to, they're probably very similar to me in grad school. And I was more concerned with what I could make my robot do, and then demo it to the funders, than what the robot couldn't do. And so that creates a bias. And so this gives, quite frankly, often a confusing impression of capabilities, which in society could be very dangerous.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the trade-off between two good choices is a familiar civil society a challenge. The trade-off between does it work or does it not work is becoming the question we ask about technology. So you think about the facial recognition example, it's a question of, well, do we want it to work well with all of its biases, or the fact that it doesn't work well with all of its biases? I think it's worth noting that philanthropy already is playing an enormous role in thinking about particularly artificial intelligence. In just the last few years, there have been 3, 4, 5, probably more than that, major independent civil society organizations dedicated to thinking about artificial intelligence. And here I'm thinking about AI Now and OpenAI, and there's the Partnership for AI. Some of these are university-based, but many of them are actually independent. And they've played a significant role. In a handful of years, the public conversation, back to the newspaper, has really shifted from a binary choice about technology that's between privacy and national security to thinking about technological systems and digital dependencies through the lenses of civil liberties and civil rights. Right. And that is a extraordinary move forward, I would argue, than a binary choice between individual privacy and national security. So there's an enormous amount that philanthropy is doing and can do. My last question to you two before we're joined by questions from the audience is, are there real opportunities that you see that are exciting to you wearing your civil society and philanthropy and democracy theorists hats about these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, clearly, we spent quite a bit of time talking about, what the technologists are up to, but I don't see as much involvement on some of these problems as sort of the more general representatives of civil society. For example, self-driving cars. People are talking about developing. I'm skeptical that this technology will be developed anytime soon. But putting that aside, there's this discussion about how we should push this technology out as quickly as possible because humans are not good drivers, and we should get people away from the wheel of the vehicles and so forth. I never hear in the debate anyone representing people that like to drive, or we are creating a world for ourselves. We are not slaves to we shouldn't be slaves to where we're being pulled by technology or other forces. We get to make conscientious decisions about the world that we want. If we decide together that we would like to allow humans to continue to drive cars forever with the dangers that exist just because people like to do it, then we get, through a democratic process, get to make that decision. It doesn't matter, what a few technologists think is better for all of us. And so we need to find a better way to have a broader participation in the debate about how we should allow technology to shape our future society. I don't actually see this happening really at all.
Well, we promised to get you thinking, and David will be here all day to take on the question of profit with honor.
Right, exactly.
And please join me in thanking David and Rob for getting us started.